Hello and welcome to Shipwrecks and Sea Dogs, Tales of Mishaps, Misfortune, and Misadventure. I'm your host, Rich Napolitano. Today, I am very pleased to have with me Eric Takakjian and Randall Peffer, the authors of a new book called Yarmouth Castle Burning. I have read it, and it is outstandingly researched. Couldn't recommend it enough. Eric and Randall, thank you so much for being here today.
Hey, it's great to be here.
Great to be here. Thank you, Rich. We appreciate it.
Absolutely. In addition to being authors, you both have storied careers in the maritime industry, among other things. Can you share a brief summary of your backgrounds?
Yeah, I've been a professional mariner since 1978. I went in the Coast Guard right out of high school. I did 4.5 years of active duty, 7 years of reserve. When I finished my active duty, I became a merchant mariner. I started out as an able seaman and I worked my way up to captain. I worked on research ships, the world's first dynamically positioned drill ship, and cargo ships, anchor handling tugs, deep sea ocean going tugs, harbor tugs, coastwise tugs, articulated tug barge units. I did one stint as captain on a passenger vessel in the Bahamas the first winter I was married. But the vast majority of my career has been in the petroleum transportation tank vessel trade. I'm presently captain on what they call an ATB, articulated tug barge unit, that's working on the West Coast. I just go wherever the boat is, and we had been in the Gulf of Mexico, and then we shifted out there, and we're running up and down the West Coast now. And so that's in a quick 10-second, that's it.
That's impressive.
And Randy?
Yeah, I've been messing around with boats all my life. Professionally, after I finished graduate school in literature and writing, I tracked down my family heritage as Chesapeake Bay waterman. And so I started going to sea as a deckhand on a Chesapeake skipjack, the Ruby Ford, dredging oysters under sail. This is, again, mid-70s, right? At the same time as Eric started. And it could have been 1870, not 1975. The lifestyle had not changed. So like Eric, I came up, as they say, through the hawse pipe as a deckhand and mate in various boats, mostly fishing industry, work boats for me, ultimately training ships, research ships, almost all under sail. So I ran a research vessel for 14 years for Phillips Academy Andover. I still have that schooner. I've done analyst gigs, filling in as captain on other schooners. It just goes on and on. But mostly sailboats for me, tugs for Eric. But we started at the same time and ended up in the same place. And we're still alive. So we haven't screwed up too badly yet. Yeah. We actually had to do a boat delivery on Eric's boat the other day in some pretty blistering winds. And you go, hope everything works out here.
Well, between the two of you, I'd say you have incredibly vast knowledge and experience for being in the maritime industry, that's for sure. What wide experiences you have, it's really impressive. And what led you to write a book about the Yarmouth Castle specifically?
Randy and I work a 3-week on, 3-week off schedule. And when I come home, Randy and I always have breakfast at a local diner up the street. We only live 6 or 8 miles apart, something like that, not very far. So we'd finished our last book, Dangerous Shallows, in search of the ghost ships at Cape Cod. And we were casting around with different ideas for different storylines for different shipwreck books. And there was one that we were focused on, but then somebody else beat us to the punch and they wrote the book that we wanted to write. It's about World War I U-boat attacks off the east coast of the United States. And a guy, Dominic, I forget his last name, but wrote a terrific book called Reaping the Whirlwind about that exact subject. So we were casting around about different things, and the idea of the Yarmouth Castle came up, and I had a small file on it, and Randy was familiar with it from having been.
Yeah, I knew. I've been on spring break in the Bahamas in the mid-'60s, and Yarmouth Castle, she just burned, and of course the Bahamas Star was coming into Nassau 2 or 3 times a week, and the Star was the rescue boat. So I remembered those days where this kind of grand old liner, the Bahamas Star, was like docked in Nassau and being celebrated for her rescue of the Yarmouth Castle. And so anyway, we were scratching our heads. I remembered that. Eric goes, yeah, I know about that. And so we started. And like the more we looked into it, the more interesting it got, because one of the first things that pops up in the media stories of the time was, oh, the captain was the first guy off the ship. And we're going like, that can't be good.
Yeah, that's never good. Specifically, I've done a story about the Costa Concordia. That's a pretty famous one where the captain really was fault and negligent for sure.
The difference is that the captain of the Costa Concordia went to jail and the Yarmouth Castle skated free.
Yeah.
Different times.
You were talking a little bit about the Bahamas Star and the cruise industry in the Bahamas. By 1965, when the Yarmouth Castle met its fate, it was already many decades old. So what is the backstory of the ship up to this point?
She was built in 1927 at the William Cramp and Son shipyard in Philadelphia. And Cramps, as it was known, was a very highly regarded shipyard. They'd been in business since the 1800s. They'd built all manner of ships, from warships, battleships, cruisers, to large transatlantic passenger liners, cargo ships, coal colliers. They had a big repertoire of ships that they built, and were always known for building high quality ships. Her and her sister, the Yarmouth Castle was originally named the Evangeline, and her sister was the Yarmouth. They were built for the Boston and Nova Scotia service, for the summertime, and then they would do Bermuda cruises and sometimes Bahama cruises in the winters. And they were both built for that and ran a regular run back and forth to Yarmouth, Nova Scotia, and were very popular with the public. And cruising in Nova Scotia was a popular place in the 20s and 30s for Americans going to Canada. And then when World War II came along...
Because of Prohibition, that's when Canada cruise trade was so popular, because you could drink and gamble.
The booze cruises.
Yeah. That's booze cruises.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Yeah. And then when World War II started in 1939, and then when the United States became involved in hostilities in World War II, both the Evangeline and the Yarmouth were requisitioned as troop ships. And they saw action in basically all theaters of the war. Initially, just transatlantic voyages, New York and Halifax to Europe, and then eventually in the Mediterranean, they were involved in Operation Torch, the invasion of North Africa. And then as the war progressed into the Pacific, both ships ended up working in the Western Pacific. As the island hopping campaign progressed into the Philippines and into the far reaches of the Western Pacific, they were both there doing that. And then at the end of the war, they were returned. They were under the management of States Marine Lines and operated by MARAD. So MARAD would requisition these ships and then assign them to different shipping companies to manage them. And then at the end of the war, they came back, and it was MARAD's responsibility. MARAD means the Maritime Administration, would have to return the ships to their pre-war state and then turn them back over to the owners. So both ships went to Quincy Shipyard in Quincy, Massachusetts, to be essentially rebuilt. And they had only, over the course of the war, had only received just the bare minimum of maintenance. They were run hard and put up wet, so to speak. And come 1945, the ships were in pretty tough shape, and also regulations had changed dramatically too. Originally, when they were built in 1927, they were built to the 1914 SOLAS standards. SOLAS stands for Safety of Life at Sea Convention, and SOLAS had changed. Since then, there was SOLAS 1929, and there was requirements. They were originally built with wooden superstructures and wooden upper decks, and there was requirements in the new regulations for decks to be steel and superstructures to be steel. MARAD realized that if they replaced the wood superstructures with steel, that it would increase the deadweight tonnage of the ship, and the ship's draft would increase, and that would make them difficult for getting into and out of some of these underdeveloped ports that they would end up running to. So they applied to the Coast Guard for a waiver. Another change that had taken place in that time when the ships were originally built, they came under the purview of the Steamboat Inspection Service when they were built, and that had been segged into the Coast Guard in 1939, I believe it was. And so it came under Coast Guard oversight after the war, and the Coast Guard granted them a waiver with a couple of exceptions. They wanted some steel trunking around the staircases and then sprinklers installed in the staterooms. And the ships were restored, returned to Eastern Steamship Lines, and then the Yarmouth went back on the Boston to Yarmouth, Nova Scotia run. The Evangeline went to New York and did the New York to Bermuda only for a couple of months. Both ships ran in the summer of 1947, I believe it was, for a couple of months. And then, sadly, they were laid up. The costs for operating the ships and union demands at that time made it basically cost prohibitive to run them under the American flag with American crews. So the ships were laid up in New York and then eventually sold. Frank Leslie Fraser bought both ships. And Frank Fraser was a fruit ship operator from Jamaica, originally of Scottish descent, and his family had moved to Jamaica and operated
banana boats.
Banana boats, essentially, in the banana trade, like United Fruit and and the others that would transport bananas and citrus fruit from Central America to the United States. And he conceived the idea of an industry essentially taking people on leisure cruises from South Florida to places like the Bahamas and the various Caribbean destinations, Cuba, Jamaica, and Haiti. And so he bought these two ships and then subsequently bought the Borinquen, which became the Bahama Star, and placed them in service. And that's the backstory from when the ships were built right up until Frank Fraser bought them and started to operate them as cruise ships out in Miami.
You talked about how they were laid up because of the operating costs of the American crew. Eventually, the ship was registered under a flag of convenience, and you talk about this in the book. Can you explain this practice and why it's significant?
Sure. Yeah, with flags of convenience, ships are registered under the flag of different countries that have less stringent regulations for operating and maintaining and constructing of ships and crewing than, say, European flag or United States flag or, say, a Australian flag or something like that. For example, when the Yarmouth Castle was reflagged to Monrovia, there was no more requirement for nationality of seafarers. When the ship was U.S. flagged, it had to have all U.S. crew. So when the ship was outflagged Monrovian and eventually Panamanian, along with her sister, they could have crew members from anywhere, which didn't necessarily have proper training. And also the requirements for maintaining the ship and equipping the ship were much less stringent than they would be if, say, they were U.S. flag or German flag or Norwegian or British flag or something like that. So it's much less expensive to operate a ship under the, say, Panamanian registry or Marshall Islands and it's Liberia. It's all still done today.
Yeah, I think if you pay attention to any of especially the cruise ship commercials on TV, you'll see that they're always Liberian flagged or Panamanian or usually not U.S. flagged. And
Right.
That must be why.
Yes, exactly.
So, well, fast forward to 1965, November of 1965. The Yarmouth Castle is about to set sail for the Bahamas. Let's talk a bit about the captain and crew of the Yarmouth Castle. What prior experience did Captain Byron Voutsinas have at the time?
He was a graduate of the Maritime Academy in Greece, I think probably in Piraeus.
Piraeus, yeah.
So he had officer's credentials. He'd worked his way up. Most of his sea time was in cargo vessels. A few years before the Yarmouth Castle accident, he'd been a skipper of a cargo vessel, but the economy turned against shipping at that point, and seafarers were really scrambling for jobs. And he found his way to Miami and entered the cruise ship trade, which, as Eric said, was just starting at that point. And so there was opportunity. He sailed in Yarmouth Castle, and did he sail on the sister ship too? I can't remember.
He sailed as staff captain on the Yarmouth Castle. Yeah.
There was enormous turnover in the ship's crew at that point during the 2 years leading up to the accident. And like captains, first officers, they came and went pretty quickly, maybe because they thought that things were kind of sketchy. But at any rate, there was Vocinas. He was the staff captain, and the current captain on the ship took leave. The people that ran the company were going like, well, why don't we just promote Vocinas? And the guy who was leaving goes, I'm not recommending him.
Wow.
But there he was. He had the credentials, and so they hired him. And by all accounts, he was very aloof. The obligations of running a passenger ship are so different because you have 400, 500, 600 people at that time who need to be entertained and made to feel good and safe. And that's different than keeping a crew of 30 max safe. When suddenly now officers are crew and passengers, he's dealing with what, 700, 800 people, right? So really wasn't the right guy for the job. He just backed into it. And as I say, the people who sailed with him didn't know him very well because he kept to himself.
And there was a language barrier, I believe. You go into detail about that between the captain and the other officers and with the crew.
Yeah, if you look at the transcripts of the accident, Vocinas' English is not good during the interviews. And of course, so English was everybody's second or third language, right? He was a native Greek. His first and second officers were Cubans, I think, right?
Yes.
So English was a lingua franca. So the staff on the boat was either Central American or Jamaican, with probably a few Filipinos mixed in.
14 different nationalities on board.
Wow.
So, yeah, that didn't help things. It definitely didn't help things when it came to training or quick response to an emergency.
So on the final voyage, the Yarmouth Castle departed. Can you describe that day and the earlier portion of the voyage?
Yeah, it was great weather, and it was the end of hurricane season, and it had been a tough hurricane season in South Florida and the Bahamas. The previous cruise of the Castle had been really uncomfortable. And so when the weather broke and people go, wow, it's finally late fall, end of hurricane season in South Florida, clear skies, light winds, folks were really in a festive mood. And a lot of the passengers were retirees from South Florida who had I think the trip cost them like $50 or something like
that
for 4 days and 3 nights to go from Miami to Nassau. And they were retirees. They were completely in a celebratory mood. It was like, oh, let's put on our Hawaiian shirts and our muumuus and parade around this kind of old ship like we're the sort of the Rockefellers and the Astors. Just so people were in a great mood. And by all accounts, actually, the mood continued to be high with the passengers because I think they had a pretty good dining room situation. I think the dinners, we looked over the dinner menus, the cooking staff was doing its job. Now, whether they shut down their ovens properly later that night, hard to say. But anyway, there was a great floor show. They had all these young Jamaicans who worked on the boat who were waiters, but they were also in the floor show, and they did the limbo stuff, and they sang the Banana Boat song, and couldn't have been better. It's what you would hope for, the festive feeling that you would hope for on a tropical cruise. Unfortunately, a little after midnight, things turned really sideways.
Yeah. When were the first indications that there was a problem?
The first indications of a problem was down in the engine room. The engine room crew that was on watch down there started to smell smoke coming through some of the ventilation ducts. And they didn't quite know where it was coming from. It wasn't really distinct, but they noticed something. And they notified the chief engineer, and then almost simultaneously, he started, instead of notifying the bridge, nobody notified the bridge of anything that was going on. He decided to go searching around the ship to find where the source of the smoke might be coming from. Simultaneously, the radio operator had just gone off watch and basically shut down the radio. He was only one radio operator on the ship, and the radio shack was aft at a bridge. He closed up the radio shack. It was a little after midnight. He stepped out on deck to have a cigarette, and he smelled a little bit of smoke too. And he thought he would go wandering around. It didn't say any. It would have been like 10 steps to the bridge to let the second mate know, hey, I smell smoke. Never did that. He thought, I'll go wandering around and see if I can find something too. So those two, the radio operator and the chief engineer, and then a passenger, this fellow Lloyd Lamb, who was a volunteer fireman. And I think he might have been a retired electrician also. But he was sharing a stateroom with a stranger, and he'd gone down to his stateroom, and the guy was getting like ready for bed, and he thought, I'll give this guy a little bit of personal space. And he left the stateroom, and he didn't really, stateroom was tight, it was cramped, it was an inboard stateroom. He didn't really feel comfortable staying in it. He said, I'll go back to the bar and have another beer. And he thought he smelled smoke too. And then it's just progressed where there was more and more. And then finally somebody walks by room 610 where the fire started, realizes there's a fire, and then they notified a second mate. The guy that was doing the rounds, this guy, Jose Arcadio, who was the seaman that was on watch, and he was supposed to be doing a security rounds, was his first voyage on the ship. He'd stepped aboard that night just before they left Miami. He'd never made a round of the ship. He saw the bridge card that described the security round, and nobody walked him around just to show him where the key clock stations were or anything like that. So he made a cursory round, and he missed the whole portside passageway where 610 was at the forward end of the portside passageway on the main deck. And he completely missed that. If he'd have made the complete round like he should have, he would have caught it. The fire basically went undetected for about 45 minutes. It was discovered. It was about 1:15 by the time the fire started, just shortly after midnight, and it burned about 45 minutes before anybody really knew there was a fire. So the problem is that all of that smoke and toxic gas was rising and then going into the ventilation system and working its way aft and into staterooms and into other public spaces. So people were starting to smell it as it was spreading, and as the fire was in what they call the incipient stage, it's just starting to burn. That went on for quite some time. And then eventually somebody notifies the bridge. The second mate calls down to the captain. It's 10 minutes of 1. The captain comes up and tells him to sound the alarm, and the captain doesn't stay on the bridge. He leaves the second mate in charge. He goes off to find out what's going on. So there's no organized response whatsoever. Everybody's running around helter-skelter. Eventually, the captain, the chief engineer, and a couple other people end up at the stateroom door to 610. They open the door. It's a raging inferno. They have a couple of hand fire extinguishers that they discharge. Of course, it does nothing. And then from there, things just go right sideways and downhill fast.
And already we see a number of errors that have happened. You go into a great detail in the book about bridge resource management. Can you explain what that is and why it's so important?
Yes, bridge resource management is the concept of utilizing the bridge team in an organized fashion to essentially manage the operation of the ship while somebody's on watch. So people think that oftentimes that it just involves navigation, but in reality, it involves much more. It's the safe navigation of the ship, it's the management of the watch, and it's the utilization of resources. So instead of having a bridge team of one, you have a bridge team of many. And that bridge team is navigating. They're the lookouts, they're the helmsmen, they're the on a passenger ship, they're the watch keepers that go around that do security rounds. And on cargo ships, they do cargo checks, temperature checks on heated cargoes on tankers, hatch checks on cargo ships that have hatches, like a break bulk cargo ship, or on a container ship that has hatches for the tween decks or the main decks below the deck stack. So it's managing all of that. And then if an emergency arises, it's managing the emergency. And where one person is handling the ship, another person's handling the emergency, and then the designated people are doing their jobs. So it's a matter of mobilizing the correct teams to address whatever issue might come up. On an ordinary day, everything's going fine, and you're sailing along on a straight and narrow, and things are good. If things go sideways, whether it's a man overboard, a fire, machinery casualty, responding to an emergency on another vessel, all of that comes underneath the bridge management umbrella.
And BRM on ships evolved from CRM in aviation, which started probably 10 years before, definitely in the 80s, because there were just way too many passenger airplane crashes. And accident evaluations proved that, like, most of them could have been avoided, right? If the co-pilot and the pilot or the flight engineer, if they'd all been talking with each other about, like, how to solve this problem, like who's going to aviate, who's going to navigate, and who's going to deal whatever the emergency is, right? Professional commercial airlines, they started to get their act together in the 80s. And the shipping industry looked at it and they're going like, oh, yeah, maybe we should do that. The healthcare industry looked at it. They were having a lot of problems in operating rooms because whoever, like the surgeon in charge was like, I'm in charge, like the chief pilot was in charge or the captain was in charge. In the meantime, like the nurses in the OR are wanting like, actually, it's the other lung you're supposed to take out, kind of. But nobody was talking with each other. So anyway, so it went aviation first, healthcare second, and finally came to our industry. And you can see the consequences in terms of accident reduction and particularly fatality reduction in all of these arenas.
Yeah, I mean, to put it simply, not that it's a simple concept, you have a plan for an emergency. Everybody should know what to do and when. And that was not the case on the Yarmouth Castle at this time. Everybody was just kind of freelancing. Nobody was in charge, but everybody was in charge. So that was not ideal. When you were talking about how many times the ship had been repurposed and then had to be reconfigured and such, that resulted in a kind of a network of a spider web of ventilation shafts and ductwork and things that you talk about in the. How did that contribute to the spread of the fire?
That was a real major contributor. When the ship originally was built, she was built with all natural ventilation. So you look at the early photographs of the ship and you see these large cowl-shaped ventilators that are up on the upper decks, and they were connected to vertical air shafts that went down into the ship that were in turn connected to horizontal air ducting that transversed fore and aft, and with grills, supply air grills in the various staterooms and public places. A lot of that ducting, the duct plenums, were all made out of wood and not metal. And then when the ship was air conditioned, it was done in piecemeal style. She actually was done in two segments where they installed one type of air conditioning that was a saltwater chiller style and another with a heat exchanger style air conditioning. And with ductwork for those two types of air conditioning installed at different times using different materials, and the ductwork was run to all of the staterooms and the public rooms, also run up in the false ceilings horizontally, but they left everything else in place. So all the original ductwork remained in place. And much of it was open-ended. So there was the free transfer of air, and in the case of the fire, heat, smoke, and toxic gas rises in these. In the case of a fire, any fire, it will rise, and it rose up and then transverse horizontally aft in the ship, because the ship had forward way on, so air was coming in through those Dorate or Cal-type ventilators and pushing air down and actually horizontally through the ship. So as that smoke and toxic gas rose, it met that air that was moving down and aft, and so it carried all of the toxic gas and smoke up and aft in the ship, and then which filtered down into the staterooms and ended up killing a lot of people as they slept in their staterooms, where many people in between the two fire screen bulkheads, essentially in the middle section of the ship, died before they ever burned. And tragically, that was a major contributor to the high loss of life on the ship.
What other conditions on the ship, both structurally perhaps or the safety equipment, were problematic?
The wooden superstructure, for one. The wooden superstructure and wooden decks, just old. It was dry. It had many layers of paint and paint and varnish over it, which was just the ideal fuel for a fire. And in the case of a fire, it also didn't provide structural support. So you had it burned rapidly and collapsed in on itself rather rapidly as well. And then from a life-saving standpoint, the life-saving equipment was not well maintained. The lifeboats were in poor state of repair. As a general rule, the ships always tied up to the dock port side too. And during the Coast Guard inspections, the lifeboats were swung out on both sides, but only the starboard boats were ever lowered during drills. And the bosun that was on board the ship, who was responsible for maintaining the lifeboats, had repeatedly asked for the brake drums to be turned down on the lifeboat davits and repairs and maintenance to be performed. And he was just continuously ignored on that. And it was something that was even pointed out during Coast Guard inspections in the past, that the linings on the brake drums and the brake drums were heavily wasted and needed to be overhauled. And the Coast Guard tried to minimize that during the hearings, but the evidence spoke for itself. When it come time to lower the boats, particularly the port boats, were very difficult to lower because of the state of the lifeboat winches. And lifeboats were in tough shape, and which didn't help matters at all.
One chapter in your book is titled simply Chaos. What was happening at the time with the passengers and evacuation efforts as the fire was spreading?
Probably the thing that caused the chaos was the fact that the fire was burning up in the center of the ship, and that many of the officers got forced to the front of the ship by the fire, and a lot of the passengers got forced to the back end, and there was no communication. That's the big story. There was just, you couldn't even wave at somebody. The fire was too intense. There obviously was like no radio telephones, loudspeaker, nothing worked, okay? So that set the stage for the chaos. And of course it set the stage for even more freelancing. What we discovered is that, particularly in the after part of the ship, as things were burning, people like Lloyd Lamb, a passenger, and some other passengers, a woman who had been a former employee. Unsung heroes rose to the surface is what I'm trying to say. And what was the guy's name who was the Jamaican guy who was the singer?
Roy Drysdale.
They took it on themselves and they risked their lives in all sorts of ways to get passengers out. Like Drysdale was hanging over the side of the ship
pulling people out of
like
holes.
by his legs,
So amazing.
hooked on a railing, like pulling people out of portals. And that was what was pretty interesting to us, is that while Volsinus had already left the ship, he thought the ship was a goner. The fire came up through the bridge. The officers were driven to the front part of the ship, and he's going, I have to get off here. I have to tell somebody. And so he launched a lifeboat, and he gets off the boat, and everybody else is running around. Oh, now what do we do? These wonderful people like Lloyd Lamb and Drysdale are risking their lives for other people.
Joan Reynolds, who was a former hostess on board, she was a strong swimmer, and she ended up on the bow. She jumps overboard, and instead of swimming to a lifeboat, she swims down the side of the ship, and she's treading water and pointing out to, like, Drysdale, who's up on deck, looking for people that are trying to get out of portholes. And so she was like directing the people that are up on deck that couldn't see the people that were in the portholes, which portholes people were sticking their heads out of. So she spent a couple hours in the water just trying to direct efforts to get people out of portholes. And then she eventually ended up at the stern. And then when she couldn't do any more, she said, well, I'll just swim to the Bahamas Star. So she started swimming to the Bahamas Star, and then a lifeboat picked her up. She didn't have a life jacket on.
And of course,
there's sharks around, you know.
And she said, and the only light she had was from the fire.
Yeah. No, I had to go back and read this whole section again, because I read it the first time and I thought, that was amazing. What did I just read? Oh, Drysdale hanging over the railing, pulling people out of porthole, and this whole rescue effort by just passengers and just part of the crew, not even the officers. I was astounded. I said, let me make sure I got that right. So a couple of thoughts about that. First, regarding Captain Vucinus, by this time, the ship didn't have any power. I believe that's correct. Communications were out. But had there been any chance to send out any distress calls?
No. By the time they decided to send them, the radio shack was burned up.
Okay.
But when people first smelled smoke, if they'd had notified the bridge immediately, they had time to do a lot. Radio shack wasn't burned up then, the bridge wasn't burned up, electrical circuits weren't burned through. They could have sounded the general alarm. They could have got people to the boat stations. They could have really done a lot if they had immediately notified the bridge and people did proper efforts. The ship could have been savable. It had a trained and experienced and coordinated crew, and they had a coordinated response. They could have saved it, but they just let it get out of control, and then it just went completely downhill.
So his decision then that he had to get off the ship to get into a lifeboat and tell somebody, that was not really a valid reasoning at that time, because there were already ships there. Yeah.
Yes.
What ships had arrived by that time?
Finpulp got there first. It was just about there because they lowered 1A, and the Finpulp was there, and they just rowed over to the Finpulp.
Obviously, that is not a good decision by the captain. What should he have done in that case?
Should have stayed on board his ship, and then directed his crew to muster the emergency station. The staff captain went with him, and the staff captain was the guy that was supposed to be in charge of the emergency squad.
That's
And so it's like they both should have stayed aboard, and the staff captain should have mustered his emergency squad and started to fight the fire, and then the chief mate would have been directed to organize the evacuation of the passengers. And even if the situation is hopeless, you can't leave the ship. If you're the captain on a passenger ship, you have to sacrifice your life. That's just the...
And even if he was stuck at the forward end of the ship, there were, about 80 people there.
Wasn't quite that many, but there was quite a few on about.
So where did Captain Vucinus stuck? He gets in the lifeboat. Where does he go?
He goes to the Finpulp, which is ahead about, 7 to 10 miles?
They were about 8 miles ahead of them, and they saw the flames and turned around and came back. And when they got back alongside, they were laying maybe a quarter of a mile, a couple of yards off the side of the Bahamas Star. So they rowed over there, and they had maybe 4 or 5 passengers on board, the staff captain, the bosun, and a couple of seamen, I guess, to row. So they rowed over to the fin pulp, and the captain on the fin pulp, he saw that there was officers in the boat, but he didn't know exactly who they were. And he told them, you got to go back and rescue more people. And so they put the passengers that they had with them on the fin pulp, and their boat was actually in the way of the fin pulp lowering their second lifeboat.
Yeah.
And the captain on Johan Lutto, the captain on the fin pulp, said, get that boat out of the way, go back to the Bahamas Star. We're going to lower our other motor lifeboat and go back and rescue more people. So they rowed back, and then eventually Vucinis ended up on the Bahamas Star. The fin pulp's motor lifeboats were towing a lot of the Bahamas Star's boats. The Bahamas Star showed up just like right after the fin pulp did, and they had 14 lifeboats. The fin pulp had 2 because they were a cargo ship, and so both ships had all of their lifeboats in the water. The Bahamas Star's lifeboats were row-type lifeboats. They didn't have any motor lifeboats, but the fin pulp used theirs as some sort of like tugboats to tow the rowing boats to either to the Bahamas Star or over to the fin pulp to drop people off.
So the fin pulp and the Bahamas Star are doing a really great job at this point, both of those captains coordinating efforts. But what complications were there during this rescue? Because there's still a number of people on the Yarmouth Castle.
Complications were probably 2 things. One was light, because it's the middle of the night. In the immediate vicinity of the fire, of course, you can see. But once you're away from that, it's difficult to see people in the water. And people had jumped over the side, either with or without life jackets. Once they start to drift away from the ship a little bit, it's difficult to see them. So they're relying on the lifeboats being able to see them. And then when the Coast Guard showed up, the first thing that Carl Brown, the captain on the Bahamas Star, asked for was light. And so the fixed wing, the Grumman Albatross that arrived first before the helicopters, they started dropping white phosphorus flares, Willie Peters. And they're parachute flares that are very bright, and they do a tremendous job of lighting up a search and rescue scene. So that was a big help. And then one of the other things that was difficult was handling injured people in the water. If people that had jumped over the side and had broken ribs or had broken legs or broken arms or were injured in some manner, was to get them out of the water safely without causing further injury was difficult. It was accomplished, but it was a difficult thing to do. Certainly.
Yeah, and then on the castle herself, the problem was that you had to get a lot of people down off the boat to the rescue boats, and there wasn't an easy way to do that. It was difficult. They could launch some of the lifeboats on Yarmouth Castle back aft, but it didn't go well for a number of those lifeboats, just as we talked about, particularly the ones on port side?
Yeah, on the port side.
On the port side. So you had to lower people down who were partially dressed, cold, scared out of their minds, getting them down into the water and then getting them aboard the rescue lifeboats from the Star and the fin pulp was a major undertaking. And it seems like they did that, like the crews on the lifeboat crews, and some of the crew on the castle did a pretty good job in coordinating, getting people over the side. I don't think anyone was lost in the water.
No. The chief mate did a good job. He ended up on the stern, and he had no idea who else was alive or available. He didn't know where the captain was, didn't know where the staff captain was. He ended up seeing the chief engineer when the chief engineer came up on the stern. But the chief mate, pretty much, he just did what he could to coordinate evacuation from the stern to try to get the boats over with people in them. And then they had a bunch of boats that were hanging around the stern of the ship once they were in the water to try to get more passengers into them from the stern of the ship. So he did a really good job back there, back in the stern, trying to get what boats were still not burned into the water and people in them, and loaded as best he could, basically working with what minimal help he had.
He started cues sort of women and children first, and getting people organized and going to the available remaining lifeboats and getting help from passengers like Lloyd Lamb. Yeah, he did a great job.
Yeah. He was a well-trained guy. He was a Cuban Naval Academy graduate. And so he did what he could working alone, essentially, with the help of fellow passengers or other passengers and whoever was available.
The U.S. Coast Guard had some helicopters that showed up, and you describe how they were trying to rescue some of the injured people off of the Yarmouth Castle. And that was just a really harrowing description. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Before I was a professional seafarer, I was a commercial pilot. When I think about what those guys flying those helicopters had to do that night, the hair stands up on the back of my neck, because maneuvering a helicopter to try to do a pickup off the stern of the Bahamas Star, even when you've got phosphorus parachute flares giving you light, you've got a Stokes litter that's swinging back and forth. People have to catch it. The thing is accumulating static electricity that you have to off charge before you try to grab the damn thing.
Yeah.
It's
dicey.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, it doesn't change. Any of these rescue stories that involve helicopter rescues at sea are just endlessly not entertaining to me, but mind-blowing when I think of how well these guys fly, and women fly these helicopters in really dicey conditions. One thing about this rescue, though, is the weather was good. I mean, this is like, when you read about like the flying in the perfect storm, these guys are pulling, the ship's going up and down 40, 50 feet. You're trying to time the helicopter to the rise and fall of the ship. Oh, my God.
It sounds incredibly difficult. It's actually way more difficult than it even sounds, I'm sure. Not that I've done it, but I can imagine. So thankfully, the weather was calm. Otherwise, we probably would have lost more people in the water, I would imagine.
Certainly.
And not to mention also that a lot, like you said earlier, a lot of the passengers were senior citizens.
Yes.
And probably struggled to stay afloat or even get over the side if they had to jump. To say that it was extremely dangerous is an understatement for these passengers. So we have the rescues going on, the Finpulp and the Bahamas Star doing a good job. The Coast Guard has showed up. Finally, they get everybody off the ship that they can, but a number of people have already died on board, of course. What was the final tally? How many they were able to rescue?
There was 552 people on board in total when the ship left, and 90 people were lost. So it was 462 people were rescued.
Given the circumstances, that's a pretty good percentage.
Yeah. Actually, 466 people were rescued because 4 died later of their injuries.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Of the 90 that died, something that stood out to me was that only 2 of them were crew. Not that I wish the crew would have died, more of them would have died, but from my perspective, I don't want to immediately assume that they didn't do their duty, but we know at least the captain and some of the officers were negligent in that manner.
It's where the staterooms were.
Yeah, it's the way the staterooms were laid out. They were just all above that room 610, the fire, just the smoke, the toxic gas, and then, of course, the flames just rose right into those staterooms really quickly. And, of course, the crew,
all slept below.
They were down. They were way down below deck. Some forward and some back aft. But a lot of them were finally off duty because they had actually been on probably longer than they should have been. But they'd been on duty since the afternoon when they loaded passengers until probably about midnight. I don't think it was like a wholesale abandonment of the passengers by the crew. It just had to do with who was in harm's way.
Those ventilation ducts were really what killed a lot of people.
We didn't
I
talk
think
about what
it's-
started the fire.
That's true. Yeah, let's go back to that. It started in what you said 610. So what happened?
610 was the forwardmost stateroom on the port side on the main deck on the inboard. There's two passageways that would run fore and aft on each deck. And the port passageway forwardmost stateroom inboard was 610. The forward bulkhead in that adjoined the galley ventilation trunk. That room was always super hot. And it was originally a hostess's stateroom. And the hostess had complained about the heat in that. And the ship had gone to the shipyard in Tampa back in September and she was there about 6 weeks, from the beginning of September to middle of October. And they decided to move the hostess to a different room. And they took all the furnishings out of the room and stripped the paneling and stuff out, but they left the false ceiling in place, which was wood paneling, and all the original ductwork was still up. And they just ended up using the room as a storeroom. They had spare mattresses in there, some broken furniture, and they had some jury-rigged lighting in the room too. There was a bare wire that ran diagonally across the room with a 150-watt light bulb hanging from it. And during the hearings, there was testimony to the fact that the gift shop operator and the hostess went to look for a mattress for the gift shop operator because he didn't like the mattress that was in his room. So they went and they looked in 610, and there was mattresses in there, but nothing suitable. And they said there was 2 or 3 mattresses, a broken chair, a red blanket that was over the top of the chair, a vacuum cleaner, and some other stuff. And they mentioned the lighting. Other people said there really wasn't much in the room. But what the gift shop operator and the hostess said was actually the case. And no doubt there was a short in that wire, that bare wire and that bulb that that started a fire, and the wire broke, fell down on all of that combustible material laying in the room and started the fire.
Wow.
Contributory to that was the galley vent trunk led up the forward side of that bulkhead that was full of grease. And the ship had been cited numerous times in Coast Guard inspections in the past, from 1958 up to 1965, that galley vent trunk was supposed to have been cleaned. And there was other 835 observations on the vents as well, as far as blanking off the ends of unused vents and removing the wood. But that galley vent trunk ended up catching fire. It was completely loaded with grease. It had never been cleaned in years. And as that fire progressed in 610, the heat in the top of that room got up to between 12 and 1500 degrees, and it caused the grease in that vent trunk to auto-ignite. And it turned that vent trunk into a flamethrower, which essentially you can see in some of the pictures. You can see where the vent trunk comes up just after the radio shack, and it's a solid sheet of flame coming out of that vent stack. And that got up to super high, over 2000 degrees, that vent trunk. So that was contributing. There was a red hot iron that was just contributing to the fire as well. And that's how it got rolling. And then, of course, all of that toxic gas and smoke was rising and finding its way aft, up and aft.
And that particular cabin did not have a sprinkler system. When you do accident analysis, you talk about the holes in this Swiss cheese finally lining up. And that's what happened here. Just all those holes, and then they just lock into position. You go like combustion.
So what was the final moments of the Yarmouth Castle? What was that like?
Somber. Everybody had been rescued. The chief engineer from the Bahamas Star had made one last circle around the castle to see if there was anyone left. He ended up, I think, picking up Roy Drysdale and Buddy, who had been scavenging the ship to see if there was anything worth taking, because they knew that they were basically castaways. So he picked up Roy Drysdale and a shipmate. He picked up Votsinus, who I guess was wandering around on deck, trying to imagine himself in charge of, at this point, a derelict. But so that had happened, and they had come back to the ship, and the finpulp captain he asked the Coast Guard aviators, can I leave my station here? And they're going like, yeah, let the Star stand by. You head for Nassau, which is where the finpulp was headed. So he was gone. The passengers, the crew, the survivors on Bahamas Star were trying to heave a sigh of relief that they were safe at the moment, but really too fired up on adrenaline to sleep. And people were just like standing at the rail of the Star, looking over at now just the smoldering remains of the castle. And the castle, when the engineering crew abandoned ship, they opened up the pilot doors, which are around the waterline. And as the ship started to list for multiple reasons, some because of firefighting water, but at any rate, the ship starts to downflood. So she's already listing. And so here you just have this like spectacle of 1,000 people really at this point on Bahamas Star, just standing there and staring, oh my God, just looking at this behemoth that is burned out and is just little by little taking her leave. But when she goes down, it's interesting, the captain of the Star, he had to deal with all these other things on his ship. And so he didn't even see it happen. Somebody said, oh God, look, there she goes. And when he turns around, she's gone.
Yeah.
And it was a kind of sad and anticlimactic moment. The climax had already come when you got everybody off the boat. And now it's, oh, wait. Now we have to get all these people to Nassau, and we have to be able to let them get in touch once.
So, of course, like any other shipwreck, there's an investigation and launched by the U.S. Coast Guard. We've talked about some of the deficiencies already on the ship, but after hearing all the testimony and examining the evidence, what were some of the more notable findings?
The first and foremost, the captain abandoning ship first, and a completely disorganized response to the emergency, just a lack of and a dereliction of duty on the part of the officers. Captain, chief engineer, staff captain were all looked upon unfavorably for their actions. There was no citations given to any of them because they all held foreign licenses, so the Coast Guard couldn't really act on their credentials. The Panamanian government had asked the United States Coast Guard to conduct the investigation because they didn't have the facilities for doing that, and they weren't equipped to it. The ship was Panamanian flagged, so the Coast Guard conducted the investigation on behalf of the Panamanian government. And then the Coast Guard dove deep into it, and they interviewed all of the passengers that they could find. They interviewed all of the available crew members. They interviewed people from the Bahamas Star, from the finpulp. And then they also talked with the Coast Guard inspectors that had inspected the ship over the previous several years, because foreign passenger vessels working out of United States ports are subject to something called a foreign passenger vessel examination. It's a biannual examination, happens every 6 months, where they come on board and basically check safety equipment. And then the ship was also classed, hull and machinery, through the American Bureau of Shipping Classification Society, and they checked they heard testimony from the ABS inspectors that had conducted ABS hull and machinery classification inspections on the ship when she was in the dry dock in Tampa that fall, and received testimony from them. They talked to the people at Miami Fire Safety, who did the fire extinguisher servicing and serviced the sprinkler system and the alarm system. So they pretty much talked to everybody, and then they examined the record of 835 deficiencies that had been issued to the ship over the previous several years, and noted the fact that many of the 835s that were issued had never been acted upon. They were not corrected, such as the wooden ductwork, closing up the wooden skylights, blanking off the ends of unused ducting. So there was many material deficiencies that were noted as well, and the lack of operational efficiency on the lifeboat davits. So there was quite a number of things that they found. And then subsequent regulations changed after this. This was a major turning point in regulations for passenger ships, both from the U.S. regulations and for international regulations as well. Congress acted, they actually did things back then, where they asked the Coast Guard if there was any U.S. flag passenger ships still sailing that had wooden superstructures. And there were actually, in fact, 3. There was 2 in the Great Lakes, the North and South American, which were operated seasonally in the Great Lakes, and they had wooden superstructures, and built 1911 and 1912, actually very well cared for ships. They were laid up, and the Coast Guard, they were laid up for the winter, which they always did. And the Coast Guard said, those guys can't sail anymore. And then there was
Delta Queen.
the Delta Queen, which was a Mississippi River sternwheeler that
Wow.
operated, and she received a congressional waiver that was actually in force right up until 2008. And the ship is laid up in Houma, Louisiana right now, and probably won't sail again. She's been laid up for quite some time, but had a popular following, and they managed to get a waiver for her. But that was it. And then the Coast Guard said no more wooden superstructures on U.S. flag passenger ships. And SOLAS 1960, which was the SOLAS convention that was in effect at that time, it was drafted in 1960 and entered into force in September of 1965, was amended again with additional regulations for passenger ship, for fire prevention, and for life-saving. And it was, they basically banned wooden superstructures after that with SOLAS, and instituted more rigorous life-saving requirements for passenger ships.
One of the problems in fighting the fire on the ship was that they had a lot of the hydrants had weak water pressure.
Right.
It turned out that the water pressure was weak because they were also filling the swimming pool from the same water system at the time. But I guess what I'd like to ask Eric is, do you think if they had figured out, if they had shut off the water to the pool earlier, do you think it would have made a difference, or was it just all too late?
If right from the get-go, they had a chance to save the ship, if the crew had responded properly, and if everybody had done their job properly right from the very beginning, they had every chance to save that ship. Yeah. But they didn't. And there was multiple mistakes made by pretty much all the officers. And it's really unfortunate. From the engineering standpoint, there was no excuse for that swimming pool fill valve to be left open. And they had, at that point in time, there was no such thing as policies and procedures for operating ships unless a specific cruise line or a specific shipping line decided to do that. And some did, mostly the Northern European ones. It certainly wasn't the case in the United States at that point in time. So there was no procedures. Even though that chief engineer had been on that ship for a long enough time, he should have known about that valve, and he should have known. He realized at the end, but by then it was too late. But he should have known that, and he should have had that done. There should have been no question. And that, had the response been immediate and been organized and laid out like it was on the station bill, the watch quadrant station bill, if they'd have mustered the emergency squad right away, and as soon as the guys in the engine room smelled a little bit of smoke, they notified the bridge right away, then a response could have been initiated and a fire main brought online, and A fire in that stateroom could have been put out with an 1.5-inch hose without any issues at all. But they just waited too long. And that's the thing with fires. You got to get on them right away. You cannot delay on that. You got to get on it right away. And we examined that a little bit in the appendix. And the ocean intervention fire was the classic example of how everybody did things right. And at the end of the day, they saved the ship and there was minimal damage. Yeah. And that's what's got to happen, is people they got to follow procedures, and everybody's got to get on it, and no screwing around. They have to get on it and get on it right away.
And in a case like this, all of these problems just compound on each
Absolutely.
other exponentially, from the first and foremost, the delay, but then also all of the other problems. The fire hoses didn't have pressure. The lifeboats didn't work right. Just the ventilation, the galley vent, everything was just complicating on an exponential level. Now, you mentioned no citations were issued as a result. So what became of Captain Voutsinas following this?
This is mostly rumor from people who had sailed with him and knew his family. He was living in Miami at the time, but after the hearings, he allegedly went to New York and started a Greek restaurant. He'd never sailed again. Of course, Carl Brown, who was the captain, a 29-year-old captain of the Bahamas Star, and he's another person who just rose to grace that night and did everything right as a seafarer. He stayed on in cruise ships for a little bit longer, right, Eric? Mm. But ultimately he became a
Miami harbor pilot
and a very distinguished career.
He was one of several heroes you could point to that night. Your book includes an impressive amount of firsthand accounts from the survivors. What sources were you able to access?
We spoke directly with the daughters of the Apuzos. It's funny where that 6 degrees of separation thing, as we started digging into this, I'm a member of the Steamship Historical Society of America. I've been a member for over 30 years. I'm on their board of directors. In that group, there's like a whole bunch of us that are steamship enthusiasts that are friends over the years and have different contexts. So my dear friend Jeff Macklin down in Florida, he and his wife Marilyn have been members for many years. And so I've known Jeff for a long time. And I reached out to Jeff when we started this project. And it was actually a dream of his from the time he was a little kid for a book to be written about this, because when he was growing up, his parents were best friends with the Apuzos, and which we talk about in the book. And then the Apuzos' 3 daughters were friends with Jeff, childhood friends. So he said, Carl and Wilhelmina Apuzzo were best friends with my parents, and Denise, Mary, and Helen all still live here in Florida, and I'm in contact with them, and we can set up a meeting. Absolutely. And I'd gone down to Jeff's house because he has a massive archive on early Miami cruise ships, and I have quite a lot of photos myself, but not nearly what Jeff has. So I spent a couple of days going through his archive and scanning photographs and looking at stuff, and Jeff set it up where we could meet up with the Apuzos. Randy was down in West Palm visiting some relatives of his wife's mom down there. So we all met, myself, Randy, and Jeff met at one of the Apuzzo daughters' house. And so all 3 Apuzzo daughters, Denise, Helen, and Mary, were there. And we spent an afternoon talking with them about their parents and their parents' experiences. And then simultaneously, Louis Netherland, who's the son of Captain Carl Brown from the Bahamas Star, he joined via Zoom. So he was able, which was really great, he was able to meet virtually anyway, the Apuzzo sisters. And we all got together in person last weekend down in Florida for a talk that I did at Norwegian Seamen's Center. But yeah, so Randy and I got to actually interview them firsthand, which was tremendous. And then my friend Bill Bunting, who is retired Miami harbor tug captain and also a member of the Steamship Historical Society of America, was good friends with Carl Brown for 25 years. They worked together docking ships in the port of Miami. Bill is a tug captain and Carl is a pilot. So Randy and I interviewed Bill and Captain Bill and got his take on Carl Brown. And then Jeff knew Carl Brown as well because Jeff used to be vice president of sales at Tropic Oil, who delivered all the fuel and all the lube oils to all the cruise ships in Miami and still does today. So he got to know over time most of the chief engineers and captains on most of the ships going in and out of Miami. And so he knows just untold people in that industry and got to know Carl Brown too. So became friends with Carl Brown. So it's like those 6 degrees of separation. You don't realize like your friend from down the street is also friends with a guy you're right, which is funny. And then there was interviews that we had from contemporary newspaper and magazine articles that we were able to get a lot of information from. And then also from the fin pulp standpoint, a friend in Finland at the Rauma Maritime Museum had the firsthand account from the radio operator on board the fin pulp that he just decided, I ought to just type this up. His recollections of 3 days or 4 days from Mobile, Alabama, where they had left from. They were in liner service where they made regular stops running back and forth between Finland and the East Coast of the United States, cargo both ways. I'll just write this up as an account. And he kept it. And it ended up at the Rauma Maritime Museum in Rauma, Finland. And Uti had a copy of it and said, hey, I got this. She photocopied it, scanned it, and emailed it to me. And sure enough, there's the radio operator's firsthand account. So we were fortunate in being able to dig up a lot of that. And then there was a radio interview, too, on the Caribbean Radio Network.
That was
Roy Drysdale.
Yeah, that was great. I stumbled over that, some weird midnight deep dive into the internet.
Yeah.
And there was a film.
A film, yeah. A Canadian film that was about the fire that had interviews with some of the survivors. So we were able to watch that and get that interview information from some of the survivors as well, which was remarkable.
But still, what we're talking about here is what is really the icing on the cake. The cake itself was the 5,000 pages of testimony that Eric got from the National Archives.
I love the research. I've been doing it for a long time, and I just love digging for the clues. And it's like one clue leads you to another clue, leads you to another clue. And we were fortunate that there was just a tremendous amount of material down at NARA it was 19 days of testimony that was given in the Coast Guard hearings for the Yarmouth Castle disaster. The Panamanian government had asked the U.S. Coast Guard to investigate, so they did. And there was basically all of those 19 days worth of transcripts. So there was, plus the exhibits and all sorts of other stuff that was there. It was a full cart of boxes of pages of information. So yeah, it was great.
What a find. Because all those interviews were done within 5 or 6 days of the accident. So people's memory was fresh, and it wasn't like they were already starting to spin their mythology.
Well, all of that adds a really rich depth to the book. I mean, I read a lot of shipwreck books, but when you have these firsthand accounts, these people that survived it, that were there, it really just gives you a good perspective. And thankfully, we still have those. We have those records and that testimony.
It was a compelling reason to write the book for us, because it's a cautionary tale, and there is so much caution that was emerging from those interviews that was so personal, so palpable, that it makes the tale more memorable and valuable to all of us who still go to sea, because for guys like Eric and me who've done hundreds of thousands of miles at sea and way too many decades to count, it is easy to get cavalier until you hear a story like this and you go, wait, let's just stop and think a second here before we do this thing, even if it's just moving a 40-foot sailboat from 12 miles down the coast in moderately dicey weather. Let's stop and think so we do this right and nobody gets hurt, nothing gets broken, right? That was the impulse.
And what is the status today of the wreck? Has it been found? Do we know where it is?
It's just off at Great Stirrup Cay there. It's west-northwest of Great Stirrup Cay in the Bahamas. It's in about 2,000 feet of water. It's in that Northwest Providence Channel, which is a deep cut that separates the Grand Bahama Bank from the Little Bahama Bank. And the Bahama Star marked a position where she sank, and they had good bearings, range and bearings off the lighthouse there. So Carl Brown made a notation of it. His actual chart, navigation chart that he used is in the National Archives, and I photographed it down there, and that photograph is in the book, like basically a zoomed in photo, but it shows the fix of where the ship sank.
Yeah.
It'd be interesting to side scan it at some point in time. So if I happen to be down there with a side scan at some point, maybe we'll do that. I don't know.
Where can listeners find and purchase Yarmouth Castle Burning? Like I said, I highly recommend it. So where can everybody find it?
Sure, they can get it from Schiffer Publishing, and Schiffer has their own website. It's a great website, and you can just go to schifferpublishing.com or on Amazon or Barnes & Noble or wherever books are sold. We're immensely pleased with Schiffer. They're just great people to work with, and we couldn't be more pleased on how this book came out. Well, leave us reviews, too, if they could be so kind. It really helps us out.
Do you have any other social media or other work you would like to share?
Our previous book, Dangerous Shallows in Search of the Ghost Ships of Cape Cod, which came out 5 years ago, I guess, something like that, is a good book. And that's available Amazon, Barnes & Noble. If you're a shipwreck fan, you probably enjoy that as well. And
it brings to life Eric's other career, which is
finding
and diving.
Yeah.
Shipwrecks. Eric doesn't talk about it much, but he's one of the most experienced deep wreck divers in the U.S.
Well, Eric, I saw your presentation at Sea Rovers back in March, so that was really well done. I enjoyed it.
Oh, cool. Thanks. I enjoyed yours too.
Yeah. Oh, thanks. A little bit different from all the other ones that were there, but I had a good time there. Everybody was super nice.
Yeah, glad you enjoyed it.
Eric Takakjian and Randy Peffer, thank you so much for joining me. The book is Yarmouth Castle Burning. Fantastic job, and I really appreciate the time you took today to talk to me. Thank you so much.
You bet. Love talking with you.
Thank you, Rich. We really appreciate it.